My name's Jeanne Wright. I was born in 1940, and so when you think about it, that was less than 100 years that the pioneers had been in the valley. So my great-great-grandmother, she knew firsthand about these stories, and she loved to tell me these stories about her parents and her siblings and their trek. Well, this one I'm going to tell you about today is, her name is Maren Rasmussen. She came from Denmark, and I will mostly talk about her because she is a fascinating character to me, that she would do this for her husband. They lived in Denmark on an estate that her husband's father had acquired throughout many years of work. And he had, the only one left in his family was his old aged mother, and she was very ill. And so one day the Mormon missionaries came, and they were creating quite a stir in his town in Denmark. And so he went and listened. The minute he listened, he knew it was true. And his goal was to go to Zion, to be amongst the saints. And that's what he was trying to accomplish. He went home and he told his wife, "We're selling off all of our property, our huge house with our servants, and we will go to Zion." And she must have gone along with it, but on their voyage they went from Denmark to Germany to Liverpool, and then they got on a ship and went to New York. And but the interesting thing is, after he had sold all of his property, he also paid for 30 immigrants through the Perpetual Immigration Fund to board passage to America. So those people would never have been able to come to America if he hadn't paid their passage. They lived on the ship in luxury, and so the crossing was quite nice for them. And they got to New York, and then they got on a train, and they eventually ended up in Iowa City, where he purchased the most expensive Conestoga wagons, 2 and oxen, and a lovely surrey for his wife and children. And so he then decided that we need to get to Zion. We need to go. Brigham Young cautioned him not to go because of the weather. But it was Indian summer and the weather was great. And so he said, "I see no problem." So they hooked themselves on to the Martin Handcart Company. They started out on their journey, and everything was fine until they hit Wyoming. Then the blizzards came. It was 20 below zero. The wind was horrible, and the Martin Handcart people were freezing and dying. On the way, they lost their one twin daughter, Christina, and that was a hardship for the mother because she had to bury her in a snowdrift along the trail. They carried on, but the weather was even worse. And of course, we know the story of the Martin Willie Handcart Company. I didn't realize that this had happened to my ancestors until I went on trek. And I was looking at the people's names on the plaque, and the one name was in gold of people who had passed on the journey, and that was Christina Rasmussen. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so then I looked on up to where the parents were, and that was Hans and Maren Rasmussen and their 5 other little children. And so they were there in the blizzard for the Martin Handcart Company. The rescuers came and took them to Zion, and when they got there, they had nothing, absolutely nothing. They had had to chop their oxen up when they froze to death for make soup. Hans said, if we only had a little salt and pepper, it would have been much nicer. And so they carried on to Zion with the rescuers, and immediately when they got there, they were sent to Sanpete County in Ephraim, Utah, to settle that area. There they had lots of hardships with the Native Americans, and but that's a whole nother story, because Maren said if she could have only had a cook stove in her house, because she lived in a soddy and a little adobe house. And she lived her life that way, her and Hans. Their children were all stalwart Mormon men and women, and they had survived all of this hardship. I've often thought about her as I've lived my own life and thought about when we've had trials, but I always go back to the fact that Maren Rasmussen, my goodness, I think I would have stopped at Iowa City and said, you know what, Hans, you just go on to Zion and you call me when you get there and I'll come when you get us a house. But they had so much faith. What's interesting about Hannah, his second wife, when she was 16, she joined the church and her family kicked her out. And so she went to Liverpool to work for two spinster sisters who had a lace factory. She had been baptized in the River Preston, so she was a member, but they told her she couldn't tell anyone that she was a Mormon. So she would have to go to the Lutheran church every Sunday. One Sunday she was walking to church and she heard a Mormon hymn. And the Mormon hymn was so beautiful and she was so excited. And she followed it, and there she met the Mormon congregation. So she would tell the spinster sisters she was going to the Lutheran church, but she would do a sidetrack and go to the Mormon church instead. And there she met a missionary named Bent Rasmussen. So many years later, when Hannah was a widow and Rasmus was a widow, they found each other. And he said, Hannah, I remember you. You were the most bonny girl I had ever seen. And I just fell in love with you then. And here you are. And so they got married and they lived like 20, 30 years together. And she was so happy to have found this missionary who she had fallen in love with too in those days. So it all kind of came full circle. But I often think of Maren and all the things she had to give up. She had to give up a beautiful home, people to take care of her. She didn't have to worry about anything. And yet she gave it up. And in his final remarks, he said that he would gladly do it over again. He would gladly give everything up just to be part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.